Some women are truly fortunate, or perhaps blessed is the better word. They meet and marry the love of their life, and to sweeten the deal, their mother-in-law wholeheartedly approves. What follows is a beautiful relationship that transcends the typical in-law dynamic. They become more like mother and daughter, sharing a bond rooted in mutual respect and genuine affection. These lucky women experience what many only dream of. They go on shopping sprees together, swapping stories and laughter as they browse through market stalls. They share juicy gossip, often comparing notes about the man they both hold dear, one as a son, the other as a husband. They exchange cherished family recipes and cooking tips, creating meals that reflect their growing camaraderie. They pray together, their voices rising in harmony during church services, where they sometimes show up in matching outfits that symbolize their unity. Most importantly, they forge a bond, a sisterhood, that is vital in the context of the African family, a structure deeply rooted in patriarchy. In such a system, unity among women becomes essential, as it provides them with a collective voice strong enough to influence decisions. Without it, the men are left to call all the shots, and let's just say, not every decision by these men is a stroke of genius. It's a beautiful, heartwarming relationship, a true blessing. But this was not Taffy's story. Like every woman, Taffy dreamed of marrying the love of her life and being embraced by his family. She hoped for acceptance, understanding, and a warm relationship with her mother-in-law. But this was not Taffy's own mom's story either. Taffy's life took a sharp and painful turn in her teenage years when her father passed away. It was as though his presence had been a shield, holding back a wave of misfortune that crashed down the moment he was gone. With his death, everything seemed to unravel. Her mother was left destitute, literally with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fabric she tied around her waist. The family goats, the pots and pans, and every other possession they owned was swiftly taken by her father's relatives. In their eyes, her mother was no longer part of the family, and they left her to fend for herself. No one came to her defense, not a single in-law stood by her side. That was when Taffy's mother painfully realized the truth: her mother-in-law had never liked her, and now that her son was gone, she didn't even try to hide her disdain. Taffy grew up in her maternal family's care, but the bitterness of those early injustices stayed with her. Then came her wedding, a day meant to be filled with joy and celebration, but it instead became a day of humiliation and heartbreak. In an astonishing and infuriating turn of events, a delegation from her father's side arrived to claim lobola on behalf of her late father. Despite never having raised her or supported her, they demanded payment, stating their price with cold detachment. They refused to negotiate and went so far as to threaten to annul the wedding if their demands weren't met. It was a cruel display of greed and entitlement, one that left Taffy shaken to her core. On what should have been the happiest day of her life, Taffy found herself locked in a bathroom, her heart heavy with anger and sorrow. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to process the injustice, but even in that moment, her family offered no solace. Instead of joy, her wedding was marred by the painful reminder of a fractured family and a legacy of bitterness that seemed impossible to escape. Taffy had retreated to the bathroom, overwhelmed by the turmoil caused by her father's family and the weight of the day. As she wiped her tears, there was a sharp knock on the door. It was her soon-to-be mother-in-law, standing there with an air of impatience and an expression that was anything but warm. "Your family is such a disgrace," she said bluntly, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's a good thing you're marrying my son, a good family. You're lucky to be joining a classy family like ours." The words hit Taffy like a slap, leaving a sour taste in her mouth. The interaction felt cold, transactional, and entirely devoid of the warmth she had hoped for. Her mother-in-law's words painted a picture of acceptance, but her body language told an entirely different story. The stiffness of her posture, the quick glances away, and the tight smile she offered all screamed disapproval. Taffy could tell this woman wasn't happy about her becoming part of the family. For now, her mother-in-law seemed to be playing the game, pretending to tolerate the union. When Taffy mustered a smile, she mirrored it with one just polite enough to pass. When they were left alone, she would initiate small talk, but the conversations were superficial and never ventured into anything personal. It was as though she was keeping Taffy at arm's length, maintaining the illusion of civility while her true feelings simmered just beneath the surface. This unspoken tension weighed heavily on Taffy. The woman's presence felt like a storm cloud hovering over what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. Even as Taffy smiled and laughed with the guests, the words from that bathroom encounter echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that she wasn't truly welcome in this classy family. As her husband began to say his vows, Taffy felt an undeniable wave of love wash over her. In that moment, everything in the world seemed to fall into place. His words carried a sincerity and depth that left no doubt in her mind. He loved her deeply, wholly, and unconditionally. She thought back to when he first pursued her. At the time, she had done everything she could to discourage him, playing every trick in the book to keep him at a distance. But he was relentless, persistent and stubborn to a fault. He was as relentless as a bee buzzing around a flower in full bloom. No matter how many walls she tried to build, he would patiently, determinedly tear them down. It was both maddening and deeply charming. Now, standing before him on their wedding day, she couldn't help but feel relieved that things had moved quickly toward marriage. If they hadn't, she wasn't sure she could have managed his persistence much longer. He was one of those rare people who, when they set their sights on something or someone, they wouldn't stop until they had it. Yet, beneath that unwavering determination, he carried a heart full of gold. His kindness and thoughtfulness balanced his stubborn streak in a way that made him impossible not to love. What puzzled her was how such a remarkable man could have come from such a difficult mother. His mother, with her cutting remarks and icy demeanor, was a stark contrast to her son's warmth. It made Taffy question if perhaps she was being too quick to judge her mother-in-law. After all, wasn't it possible that this woman's cold exterior was just a mask, a shield born from her own struggles? Maybe time would reveal a softer side. Yet, deep down, Taffy couldn't shake a truth she had come to understand. A mother's love is powerful, perhaps the most powerful force in the world. But that love, if not kept in check, could twist into something unhealthy. It could become possessive, controlling, even toxic. Maybe that was what she was witnessing in her mother-in-law, a love for her son so strong that it had warped into something unkind. Only time would tell if that bond could evolve into something healthier, something that wouldn't overshadow the happiness Taffy and her husband had just begun to build together. Fast forward 15 years, Taffy and her husband, Simba, were thriving as a couple. Their bond had only grown stronger over the years, built on mutual respect, love, and a shared drive for success. They were now proud owners of multiple properties, a testament to their hard work and partnership. Simba had excelled in his real estate development business, and Taffy, now a successful lawyer, complemented his work perfectly. Together, they had built not just a life but a fortune, becoming a formidable team both in business and in love. Yet, despite their achievements, there was a void in Taffy's heart that wealth and success could not fill. They had no children. For Taffy, it was a source of deep pain and longing, a shadow cast over an otherwise bright and beautiful life. To make matters worse, everyone seemed to think the blame lay squarely on her shoulders. Isn't it remarkable, she often thought, how you can have all the money in the world, all the power, all the connections, but some things remain beyond your reach. Children, for her, were that unreachable dream. She had tried everything. Doctors, specialists, alternative therapies, and even the fervent prayers of countless elders, she had spared no effort. But despite it all, she remained childless, and each failed attempt only deepened her sense of despair. What made it even harder was how her mother-in-law used this against her. Every interaction, every conversation seemed to carry an undercurrent of blame and judgment. Her mother-in-law's subtle but stinging comments were like daggers, piercing Taffy's already fragile heart. "You've built houses," her mother-in-law would sneer, "but where are the children to fill them?" The insinuations weren't always so direct, but they were relentless. Taffy felt as though she were under constant scrutiny, as if her worth as a wife, and as a woman, was being measured by something she had no control over. The pressure of societal and family expectations weighed heavily on her, threatening to break the strong, confident image she had worked so hard to create. In private moments, Taffy often wondered how life could be so unfair. She and Simba had conquered so many challenges together, but this one seemed insurmountable. The ache in her heart grew heavier with each passing year, and the rift between her and her mother-in-law widened, fueled by an issue that money, love, and determination could not resolve. As the end of the year approached, Taffy prepared herself for what had become an annual tradition, visiting Simba's parents. It was a custom she upheld out of respect, though it often left her feeling drained. Simba was the only boy in his family, surrounded by sisters who each brought their own unique dynamics to the gathering. One of Simba's sisters lived in Texas and was the epitome of American assimilation, or at least, an exaggerated version of it. Her thick American accent often felt like it was trying too hard, as though it were a carefully crafted mask to hide some underlying insecurities. While she was generally pleasant, her mannerisms often bordered on pretentious, leaving Taffy unsure whether to laugh or roll her eyes. The other sister, who lived locally, was the complete opposite. She was always bustling about, seemingly perpetually pregnant. Baby number 6 was now on the way, and her energy seemed to center entirely around her growing brood. Taffy often admired her ability to juggle motherhood, though the constant chatter about diapers, baby names, and feeding schedules could be overwhelming. For Taffy, these visits were an exercise in patience and emotional endurance. The tension with her mother-in-law, the subtle sibling rivalries, and the unspoken judgments that hung in the air made these gatherings far from relaxing. She knew she needed to brace herself for the whirlwind of family dynamics she was about to step into. Before they left for the visit, Taffy took a moment to kneel in prayer. She poured out her heart, asking for strength, grace, and the wisdom to handle whatever the day might bring. It was a small act of faith, but one that grounded her. As she rose from her knees, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't anticipated, as though she had been fortified for what lay ahead. Looking back later, Taffy would realize that taking that moment to pray was one of the best decisions she could have made. It gave her the patience to navigate the chaos, the resilience to withstand the sharp words and probing questions, and the clarity to focus on what truly mattered, maintaining peace and dignity in a space that often tested both. When Simba arrived home, ready to set off for their trip, the look in his eyes spoke volumes. His gaze lingered on Taffy, intense and filled with admiration, as if he was seeing her for the first time all over again. There was a hunger in his expression, one that made Taffy's heart race. She knew that look too well. It was the look that always meant trouble, the kind she both dreaded and secretly loved. Taffy was a woman of striking presence. Her figure, generously built and perfectly maintained, radiated confidence. She carried herself with a natural grace, her curves complemented by a polished sense of style that always left Simba captivated. She knew how to take care of herself, and it showed in every detail, from her glowing skin to the way her dress hugged her form just right. As Simba approached her, his lips curled into a mischievous grin. Taffy's instincts told her what was coming before he even said a word. "We're not leaving just yet," he murmured, his voice low and teasing. Before she could protest, Simba wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. His touch was firm but tender, and Taffy felt her resolve melting away under his affection. True to form, he couldn't leave without first making love to his wife. It was as if the trip couldn't properly begin until he had expressed the depth of his love for her in the most intimate way. Their connection was undeniable, and even after all these years, his passion for her hadn't waned. By the time they finally set off, Taffy was left both flustered and glowing, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Simba, ever the content husband, looked as though he had already won the day. Together, they embarked on their journey, their bond reaffirmed and their spirits lifted for whatever lay ahead. When they arrived at their in-laws' home, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Simba's father was pacing nervously, his brow furrowed in frustration. It didn't take long for them to understand the source of his anxiety. Carrie, Simba's younger sister, had suddenly cancelled her plans. Her doctor had ordered her to rest, warning that she could need an operation at any moment. This unexpected development threw everything into disarray. Carrie had been tasked with picking up their eldest sister, Berita, who was flying in from Texas. Now, with Carrie unable to make the trip, the responsibility fell squarely on Simba and his father. The problem? The airport was a solid 5-hour drive each way, and if they didn't leave immediately, there was no chance they'd make it in time. Without much time to deliberate, they sprang into action. Simba and his father quickly grabbed their things, preparing for the long drive ahead. This left Taffy and her mother-in-law behind, with no choice but to spend the day alone together until the men returned. Taffy felt her stomach knot at the thought. She was trapped in the dragon's lair, no less. The idea of hours alone with her mother-in-law was daunting, to say the least. What on earth were they going to talk about? The air already felt thick with unspoken tension as they waved goodbye to their husbands, who pulled out of the driveway in a flurry of dust. Taffy forced a polite smile as her husband's car disappeared down the road, silently praying for patience and grace. She glanced at her mother-in-law, who stood beside her with an expression that was hard to read. Was she annoyed? Unbothered? Or, even worse, was she excited to take advantage of this unexpected chance for a one-on-one conversation? It's just the two of us now, her mother-in-law said finally, breaking the silence. I was hoping we would get this time alone to talk through a lot of things. Taffy swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to think of a safe topic to fill the awkward void. Hours stretched ahead of them like an eternity, and she braced herself for what was bound to be a challenging day. Hattie, Taffy's mother-in-law, wasted no time setting her plan into motion. She was a woman on a mission, and subtlety was clearly not her strong suit. Before dinner, as Taffy stepped into the shower, she heard a loud and insistent knock on the bathroom door. Startled, she barely had time to respond before Hattie barged in, holding a small bottle filled with what looked like crushed leaves suspended in oil. Listen, take this and rub it all over your body, Hattie said, her tone firm and matter-of-fact. It should help when your husband gets back. We need to get you a baby, I'm tired of waiting for Simba to give me grandchildren. Taffy stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. Let me rub it for you, Hattie offered, stepping closer, the determination in her voice making it clear this wasn't up for debate. No, thank you, Taffy said, her voice as calm as she could muster. Let me finish bathing first, and then I'll handle it myself. Satisfied, or perhaps too focused on her goal to notice Taffy's reluctance, Hattie nodded and left the bathroom. As soon as the door closed, Taffy exhaled a long breath, her mind racing. She stared at the mysterious little bottle in her hand for a moment before decisively tossing it into the bin. There was no way she was going along with whatever concoction her mother-in-law had whipped up. But Taffy knew this was only the beginning. Hattie's first move had been bold, and if her persistence was anything like Simba's, this was far from over. Taffy braced herself for whatever was coming next. As Taffy descended the stairs, the hum of activity greeted her. She overheard a snippet of conversation. Simba and his father's delegation, returning from the airport, would arrive in about 30 minutes. The air felt charged, as though the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation. The dining table was already set, each place carefully arranged with precision. Taffy admired the effort but couldn't shake the growing unease that had been gnawing at her all afternoon. Please don't touch anything, the maid said abruptly, intercepting her as she approached the table. Mama said I need to make sure the seating is correct. The maid motioned to the table and began pointing out the seating arrangement. According to her mother-in-law, everyone had a designated spot, and she meticulously explained where each person was meant to sit. This one is yours, the maid said, tapping a plate in front of an ornate chair. And this, she pointed to an extra seat, is for a guest Mama went to pick up herself. They'll be joining us for dinner. Taffy's stomach tightened. Something about this new guest unsettled her. Her mother-in-law rarely entertained guests without fanfare, and the fact that she had personally gone to collect this person only added to the unease. As the maid disappeared into the kitchen, Taffy stood there, staring at the table. A feeling she couldn't quite put into words crept over her, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Her eyes fell on a designated seat, and the knot in her stomach tightened. Was she being paranoid? Maybe. But she couldn't ignore the suspicion that her mother-in-law was up to something. Acting quickly and with trembling hands, Taffy swapped everything on her plate with the items from her mother-in-law's place setting. The water bottle, the cutlery, the glass, the napkin, she switched them all. Her heart raced as she completed the task, stepping back just as the maid returned from the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, questioning her actions. Was she overthinking things? Was this just a product of her strained relationship with her mother-in-law? Perhaps. But then again, there was no harm in being cautious, right? Better safe than sorry, she thought, as she walked away from the table, her nerves still buzzing. Dinner hadn't even begun, and the night was already shaping up to be anything but ordinary. Berita began the prayers, her thick American accent taking center stage as though she were delivering a performance rather than a blessing. The prayer was less about the food and more of a monologue, a mix of updates about her accomplishments, her plans for the new year, and a token nod to the meal. Taffy could feel Simba nudging her side throughout, clearly amused, but Taffy was far from entertained. Her attention was fixated on the guest her mother-in-law had brought to dinner, Sekai. The name alone was enough to sour her mood. Everyone at the table knew who Sekai was, Simba's first girlfriend. Though Simba had long moved on and completely severed ties, the nerve of Hattie to invite her was beyond comprehension. It wasn't that Taffy felt threatened, Sekai was no competition. Time had not been kind to her. She looked much older than her years, her eyes carrying a strange glint that bordered on desperation or even madness. Being an unmarried woman of a certain age in the village had clearly taken its toll. But still, the audacity of her mother-in-law left Taffy fuming. Dinner had barely started, and Taffy had already lost her appetite. She picked at a few items from Simba's plate, her irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Hattie seemed unusually fidgety, her nervous energy palpable as she glanced around the table. She barely touched her own food, her gaze frequently darting toward Taffy. "Please, everyone, eat," she urged, her voice strained, though her eyes were locked on Taffy. Taffy met her gaze and, out of sheer defiance, switched her water bottle with Simba's while maintaining eye contact with her mother-in-law. The flicker of shock and annoyance on Hattie's face was undeniable. When Simba reached for the water bottle, Hattie quickly intervened, snatching it from his hand with a nervous laugh. "Let me get you a cold one," she said hastily, leaving the table. The tension at the table was palpable, though the others seemed oblivious. Taffy, now distracted by a conversation with Berita about law practice in the US, didn't notice Hattie. While Taffy was focused elsewhere, Hattie quietly sat back down and, without a word, began drinking from the water bottle on her seat. So much had happened in such a short span of time, and yet the dinner continued as though nothing was amiss. Taffy, still engaged with Berita, missed the moment entirely, but a quiet sense of relief settled over Hattie over her intervention on the bottle. Little did she know that the bottle she was drinking from was the one originally meant for Taffy. The meal unfolded under a veneer of politeness, masking the undercurrents of tension that threatened to surface at any moment. That night, chaos descended upon the household. Hattie's health took a sudden and alarming turn, leaving everyone scrambling for answers. She had been fine, or so it seemed, through most of the day, her sharp tongue and commanding presence as strong as ever during dinner. But as the hours wore on, she began to struggle. By midnight, her condition had worsened so severely that the family rushed her to the hospital. The night was long and grueling. The local hospital could do little to stabilize her, and by morning, it became clear that she needed to be transferred to a better-equipped facility in the city. Despite the desperate efforts of the medical team, Hattie's battle came to an end shortly after her arrival. The matriarch of the family drew her last breath, leaving an air of shock and sorrow in her wake. In the days that followed, Taffy found herself haunted by the events of that evening. At first, it was grief and confusion that consumed her, but then, like a bolt of lightning, the realization struck. The water bottle. The subtle glances. Hattie's peculiar nervousness during dinner. Everything fell into place, and Taffy felt her blood run cold. Her prayer from earlier that day echoed in her mind, a prayer she had whispered while kneeling in her home before the visit. It had been a simple plea for protection, for strength to face whatever the day might bring. Now, that prayer seemed to hold a deeper meaning, one that sent shivers down her spine. Taffy couldn't shake the thought, this could have been her. Whatever had happened to Hattie, it might have been meant for her instead. The realization left her rattled, a mix of relief and dread coursing through her. She and Simba had always promised each other honesty, a vow to share everything, no matter how difficult. But this was something different. This wasn't a secret she could share, not even with the man she loved most. Some truths, she decided, were best left unspoken. Taffy resolved to carry the weight of that night's events alone. It would be a burden she would take to her grave, a silent acknowledgement of what might have been. Yet in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, that prayer would ring in her ears, a reminder of the thin line that had separated her from her mother-in-law's fate. I could delve deeper into the rest of Taffy's story, but for now, her focus lies elsewhere. She has a lot of comforting to do, as grief has a strange way of igniting intimacy, its nature's bittersweet aphrodisiac. In the face of loss, she knows she must be her husband's pillar of strength, his anchor in this turbulency of sorrow. Taffy understands that her presence, her warmth, and her unwavering support are what he needs most right now. This moment is about being there for him, about letting love and connection mend what loss has fractured.